Okay, and we are live. Welcome, everyone, to another great offering from the Paul Robeson House Museum. My name is Chris Rogers. I serve as the program director. Today is a very special day for two reasons. One, we have this amazing online conversation, but we're also back and open to the public this afternoon. So if you're in Philadelphia, between the hours of 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., you can meet us right at the corner of 50th and Walnut Streets, and return to the Paul Robeson House Museum with updated exhibitions. So we're so excited to be back and continuing like the virtual programming, which started basically as just like, what are we going to do in the midst of the pandemic? And we're able to bring some awesome conversations to the table with a lot of our friends and people we look up to, people we learn from. So we're excited to continue that this year. Um, and let me go ahead and stop this music. Thank you, Rebel Foster. Um, Great DJ friend of mine. Get this music stopped. And I'll do our introductions for this afternoon. So, this program is titled "We Are Each Other's Harvest," which is comes from the words of Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, the great, brilliant Chicago poet, who wrote those words as a tribute, right, to Paul Robeson.
Mhm.
Um, so it's great that we have that title, and Miss Brooks serves as an amazing model of the role of literary arts, the role of continue to like lift up our legacy and continue our legacy through the arts, just as Paul Robeson did. So these conversations that we have are all about celebrating cultural workers across many different arts and how their work relates to our struggle, relates to ways of getting free, practices of getting free, and really honing our craft. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. And I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our guests with the bios that we have, right? So, and everyone should be visible. So I'll begin with Dr. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, PhD, is the author of the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the 2018 Judith Markowitz Award for LGBTQ Writers, and an assistant professor of English at Bryn Mawr College. Her writing has earned support and honors from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Yaddo, the Center for Fiction, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the NEA. Her academic book, The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, through University of Illinois Press, is coming out really, really soon, and I'll make sure that link goes into the chat. But that book it explores the politics of poetic experimentation in global Black feminist art, literature, and hip hop. Her novel, More Everything, is forthcoming from W. Norton Liveright in 2022. We also have with us Cheryl Clarke. Cheryl Clarke is a Black lesbian feminist poet and facilitator of things Black, queer, and feminist. She is the author of the 5 books of poetry: By My Precise Haircut, from the Word Works in 2016, Narratives, Poems, and the Traditions of Black Women from Kitchen Table Woman of Color Press in 1983, Living as a Lesbian, that is through A Midsummer's Night Press in 2014, Humid Pitch from Firebrand, and Experimental Love, from Firebrand in 1993, and of the critical study After Mecca, Women Poets in the Black Arts Movement, which came out on Rutgers Press. Her collected work, The Days of Good Looks, Prose and Poetry, 1980 to 2005, was published in 2006 by Carolyn Graff. She received the David Kessler Award in 2013 from the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies for her service to LGBTQ communities. After 41 years in the administration of Rutgers, she is now co-organizer of the Festival of Women Writers in Hobart, New York. And that conference and that festival is coming up again, and you'll see those details in the chat as well. And shout out to the Rutgers connection. Paul Robeson. We got some great people. um, and
And
I'm so
so
happy
they claim
to.
him.
Well, now they do, right? Well,
Yeah, now they do.
right. Um,
Now they
and And our conversation today, we have an amazing new moderator and a new board member to the Paul Robeson House Museum. So I'm so thankful she could be with us this afternoon. Crescent Molly Mason is a Black feminist philosopher and phenomenologist, interested in collective healing art practices centered in embodiment and self-referential pattern tracing. an assistant professor of philosophy at Haverford College, and the current president of the International Simone de Beauvoir. How close am I?
Yeah, you got it.
Nice. Society. Crescent gave artistic practice through a frustration with her inability to make sense of her thinking and lived experience via traditional philosophical argumentative methods. Influenced by Black women thinker artists like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Adrian Piper, Lorraine O'Grady, and her paternal aunt Karen Marie Mason, the self-translation cycle maps patterns of Black feminist healing in the face of past and present threats to Black women's lives and well-being, such as early illness, death, and perpetual state violence against Black folks. The Self-Compassion Project, the final work in this collaborative three-part collage of performance art installation, invites Black women in West Philadelphia to collaboratively annotate and map their own patterns of healing, asking them to consider themselves thinker artists. And we are excited to be a host of that project as well. And I can't wait to hear more about what that will entail. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic and go into the background. I'll be monitoring the chat, and we will have a time for questions and Q&A to pull things. But I'm going to go ahead and pass over the mic and the seat to Crescent to get us started this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you so much, Mecca and Cheryl, for having me here. And if you all will just sort of bear with me while I do a little bit more introducing, kind of to set up how I'm hoping to moderate or sort of be non-participatory in this conversation, because I'm very excited to watch you all talk with one another. So I wanted to kind of frame this in terms of how I know each of you. And Cheryl, you'll definitely do not remember this, but I actually was sort of a fly on the wall when you were participating in a documentary film about Black lesbians around 2007, 2008. And I remember sort of being around you and being just sort of kind of struck by your presence and your body sort of sense of humor and your wit and your honesty. And I just felt like, wow, what a woman to be around. So I've thought of you always in that way since then. And I'm really so very excited to see you be in conversation. And Mecca, people always think that I went to UPenn for graduate school. Mecca went to UPenn for graduate school, and I did not. I went to Temple. So, and the way that I actually know you is through actually hanging out with you in West Philly. I'm probably around like 2010 or so, and hanging out with you and people like C. Riley Norton and Leroy Kang, and just sort of being around you as a beautiful person, a beautiful presence, someone whose beauty sort of emanates from the inside out. And also like a wordsmith, a compassionate listener. So I'm just really excited. Every time I'm around you, I have wonderful conversations. So I imagine when the two of you are in conversation with one another, it is bawdy and beautiful and witty. And I would just like to be able to sort of watch you all do your thing. So that's how I'm gonna sort of handle this. Keeping that in mind, I do have some questions just sort of to get us kind of into conversation. And the first question is just about if you would describe your work, like how would you describe your work? The sort of context of this conversation frames you all as cultural workers. And so I wanted to specifically ask you kind of what does that mean to you and how does your work fit into that sort of framing? And either of you can start.
Shall I go first?
Go ahead, Meg.
I'll take a stab at it. First of all, thank you, Crescent. I'm so excited for this conversation, and shout out to Chris and to Paul Robeson House Museum. Thank you for having us. Thank you both for participating in this. Crescent, I know you envision this as sort of your position as being non-participatory, but I secretly hope that doesn't work out. I hope we all get to kind of kick it. But so yeah, in terms of how I sort of envision my work, that's been very much sort of in flux, I think, over the course of my career. I've always seen myself as a writer. And for me, that means, I've been thinking about this Jay-Z line, I'm not a biter, I'm a writer for myself and others, right? When I think about what it means to be a writer, I see myself as sort of writing, from and through my own experience. Many writers, sort of talk about writing to understand the world around them and to be understood. And I think that duality of sort of writing for oneself and writing with a sense of social locatedness and publicness in mind has been very important to me. And that's where I see the connection to being a cultural worker. As someone who writes in fiction and in, you know, some more public facing forms of nonfiction and as academic and literary scholarship, what brings all of those kinds of writing together for me is a commitment to thinking through the experiences of Black feminists, Black queer people, and Black women in a way that is both personal and political for me. So that's how I imagine my work as a kind of cultural praxis.
And Cheryl? Are you with us?
I keep freezing. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. If I freeze, I'm sorry. Well, the term cultural worker has always interested me as with the idea that writers labor and that we work for something or work in community. And especially since I see writing as a political act, something I do to some. Enlightening the world about, you know, the struggles and triumphs of people who are oppressed, i.e. in the case of my I guess I'm skipping ahead.
Uh-oh.
I know, yeah, it's freezing again.
We can hear some of it.
Yeah, kind of.
And I also think which I think is very important for us to continue to develop.
I feel like we're missing so many gems.
I know. Maybe we can try to turn the video off with that.
That's
yeah. Let's we can, you know, test some things. We're still very early in the conversation, so if you would like to, yeah, we can turn the video off and see if that helps it clear up some, or if Cheryl would like to sort of, you know, jump off for a second and try to restart it. I don't know what would help in this situation, but it is freezing as you mentioned.
Well,
I don't know.
I keep free because it keeps telling me my internet is unstable.
Yeah.
You know, like really? As much as I'm paying for this hotel room. Wait a minute, let me see if I can.
Okay, well, sort of. We'll sort of go. I heard what I did hear what Cheryl was saying was expressing sort of some kind of ambivalence around the notion of cultural work and labor. And I guess I mean, you didn't necessarily address that in your answer, Mecca, directly, insofar as it seems like what you were suggesting, that insofar as you write from a particular standpoint, you see that as doing work. And I don't know that the connection. So yeah, can you maybe speak on the notion of labor as connected to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, to my mind, labor is, of course, very much political, right? And it's sort of always political. And I think that there is something, I too think when the term cultural worker is invoked, it requires, I think, some thought, right? And I spend some time thinking about it. It isn't how I necessarily refer to myself immediately, although I do think that my work sort of falls under the umbrella of cultural work. And there's something I think valuable about naming the contributions of artists as labor, and particularly as labor that is political, and that, like, you know, the political dimensions of which need to be named. At the same time, I do think it might invite a kind of lapse in terms of understanding the extent to which all writing is political, right? And much cultural work is political. And even that, the cultural work that sort of tries its best not to be, is in fact political, right? So, you know, I share, I think, some of the need to at least reflect on that term and kind of think about what it means for me, you know?
Cheryl, did you want to sort of add to some of that? We heard sort of the beginning of what you said, but wanted to hear you flesh that out again, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, I think what I was saying when I froze, so I kept on talking. That's what I always do, keep on talking. I was saying that I believe part of our work is developing our audience. Communities. I know people say marginalized now, but I resist that term. I'm sorry.
What term did you use instead of marginalized?
I use oppressed.
Oppressed, yeah.
I know it's old-fashioned, Mecca.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, I'm with you on that. You know, I think about this a lot in terms of talking to students, right? You have to sort of make a decision how to communicate with students in a way that, you know, allows them to really interrogate the languages that are most comfortable and familiar to them, while also asking them to really think as precisely as possible about what they mean. I think often marginalized is in fact used as synonymous with oppressed, or as used as a placeholder for oppressed. And sort of like, why do we, you know, why are we not willing to talk about oppression? Often that's what we're trying to say, right? Is oppressed.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think so. I think so. So I think we have to develop what our audience, continue to develop our audience. That's part of our cultural work.
Yeah, not to stay there too long, but I think this is actually kind of an interesting distinction to make between like oppression and marginalization. I mean, I think when I teach feminist philosophy, I begin by doing an essay by Marilyn Frye about oppression. And often my students are like, why are we don't use this term anymore. What is the sort of the meaning of this? So I would really love for you to, and Marilyn Frye is a sort of lesbian feminist philosopher who's framing it in a very particular way. So if you wouldn't mind to maybe talk a little bit more about that, like what is it about oppression as a kind of term that is for you connected to developing an audience?
Well, I started writing poetry because I've said this so many times, it'll probably make both of you sick, but because of the Black arts movement, you know. And I saw the power of poetry as well as theater. Fiction as a powerful, I'm not saying it, poetry and theater. And so I sort of modeled my poetry after the Black arts movement, or in the context of the African American consciousness movement. I'll just say Black consciousness movement, because, you know, I also have problems with African Americans. So not that I don't, anyway. So I see, you know, so that framework came out of a specific definition of Black people as an oppressed people, okay? And when I came out as a lesbian, I modeled my poetry, I guess in the public domain by that point, after what Black arts movement activists did. And also women. women liberation movement, which we now call feminism. I don't mind feminism. I'll call it feminism. So women are a distinctly oppressed group, as well as lesbians. I don't need to tell you all that. So I still see, and we're still oppressed, even though we have much, much, much more consciousness about that, I think. The levels of our oppression. So that is the context I still come out of. What are we doing to get this heel off of our backs? I don't want to get into being a victim, but we are still oppressed people.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate what you're saying, Cheryl, and I agree. I think in terms of the distinction between marginalization and oppression as words and as, sort of political concepts, right? I think oppression names power in a more direct, specific way, a more explicit way that is necessary. And like you, Crescent, when I think about how my students think about marginalization, they are thinking about power, and yet the term doesn't always name it, right? I mean, power is what does the marginalizing.
Mm-hmm.
And, then sort of claiming or creating or generating another kind of power, or critiquing power at least, is what sort of, replaces the margin, or sort of shifts the margin, or brings, from margin to center, right? That spatial metaphor. Power is what sort of, what constructs and what therefore can deconstruct that spatiality. And yet, if we don't name it, there's something lost. And I do think that oppression names that relationship to power. As a fiction writer, it's interesting, right? Because again, that the spatial metaphor of marginalization does have a particular kind of, allure. There's something sort of interesting about that notion of the margin from a narrative standpoint, right? Who is the central character? Who is a peripheral character? Who is the central point of view? Who's the narrator? Who's a secondary character, right? All of these, especially in terms of point of view, all of these do sort of invoke questions of margin and center, right? Who's the central character? Who's the central speaker of a poem even, perhaps, right? So I think there's something useful there as well. But if you're reluctant to name power, that always, I try to teach my students at least, right? That anytime you find yourself reluctant to name power, that's a sign that you need to think a bit more deeply, and I think oppression does that work.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So thinking about, Cheryl, you connected this to how you were informed by history, by the Black Arts Movement history. And so thinking about kind of things that informed us in the past, I'm interested in sort of future things in the future. We're talking about our students. We're talking about, Cheryl, you mentioned earlier, being in community. So what are sort of interesting sort of developments? What are the kind of interesting sort of theoretical or sort of cultural developments that you see sort of happening right now that you find inspiring or challenging to this kind of history?
Oh man. It's frustrating. It's like, the genius is like about to drip out.
Pardon me?
You froze for a second, but
we're back now.
We're back.
Okay. I was trying to think of that question, what cultural trends, what new ones do you feel influence your poetry? And I have a hard time with it. I still have a hard time with it. I'm trying to think of some, but maybe a new book of poetry by somebody like Nikki Finney. Maybe that novel that's coming out by
Mecca.
Music.
Go ahead and insert that there.
Perhaps music and film. But I have to say this, and I'm not trying to flatter Mecca, But when I read her book of short stories, and I'm not really a short story aficionado, because most people can't write them.
This is true.
No, they're hard to write. Come on, let's face it.
Not easy.
Yours are so different and so beautiful, and written so beautifully, but they're so different because of the characters in them. Because, nobody writes about adolescent fat Black women who survive, really. And I was thinking about that. I don't know if I'm so I guess it's more new work by people who are already out there, Crescent. I don't really, I'll tell you this. I did watch My Life, as Mecca told me to.
I don't know that. What is My Life?
It's the Mary
J.
documentary.
So I'm sorry.
The Mary J. Blige documentary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we traded some,
Frozen Crescent.
Is it recommended? Is it recommended across the board?
It is recommended by me, yes, for what that's worth. Just as a depiction of, go ahead. I feel like I don't want to.
I know.
Right.
Maybe Cheryl, maybe we should try turning your video off and see if that helps.
Yeah.
Hear me now?
Okay, let's try now.
Yes.
I hear you.
Okay, so we can hear you now too.
Oh, okay. So I think the animation is very interesting. So I think perhaps I
thought we had it.
I thought so too. Solution.
Though I'm not sure if I can achieve it.
If you can achieve what, if you don't mind?
The collaging.
Okay.
The mixing of media.
Yeah. So in the documentary, it's true visually. There's a lot that's going on that's really interesting. I've only watched it once, but yeah, there's a lot of animation. There are a lot, and there's a kind of hybrid montage feel.
Yes.
Which I think is something that, Cheryl, I see across your body of work in terms of just thinking about poetry and poetics in multiple ways, for sure. And it is interesting. And thank you for what you said about my work. I think, similarly, I think part of why my stories, for me at least, the experience of trying to write short fiction was different because, my relationship to narrative and to story arc is always driven by character and language, which I think my stories don't always feel like stories as much as, or not only at least like stories. I hope that they feel like poems. I hope they sometimes feel like essays. I hope they sometimes feel like songs. And part of why I'm glad you did get to watch the Mary documentary, I thought too that there was a beautiful aesthetic complexity to it that I think really does Mary justice as an artist.
Yes, it does. I mean, really, she looks very good in it.
Yes. Yes. And just the visual scape, and even the sonic scape. I mean, it begins with her reflection on Roy Ayers' The Sunshine, right? And how she grew up hearing that song and listening to that song. And of course, those of us who grew up listening to her know that sample is really important to her song, My Life, right? And sort of, we get this really beautiful animated flashback to her as a child, connecting with art in this, again, very sort of stunning artistic visual scape in the film. I think it did a lot to really speak to the complexity of Black women artists in a way that is not always, we don't always see rendered in, biography, biopics, or just media in general.
And do you have any sort of that was connected to Cheryl? I don't know, Cheryl, if you have anything else to add or if you're there.
I was interested in that margin and center question that Mecca said, was talking about in terms of your fiction, Mecca. And I was thinking about that, the secondary characters and the main character. And it made me think of that book, which I have just read, though it's rather old. That book, The Known World, you know that book by that guy, Edward P. Jones?
Yeah.
I had never read the book before, you know, and a friend of mine said, you need to read this. I said, oh, okay. It was interesting, the number of characters in that book. You know, he has a lot of characters in that book. Secondary characters, you know, who come from the margins to the center and go back to the margins.
Right. I guess I'll jump in. But Cheryl, if you come back,
That question of margin to center, because a friend of mine's husband, he said, y'all need to come, all of us need to go into the center, or some of the rest of y'all need to come to the margins with the rest of us.
Who's y'all? Who was he talking to? I'm curious.
Yeah, and what would that mean? I mean, and like, what is that? I'm what spatially, sort of philosophically, I'm wondering, like, what even does that mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, again, the kind of, feminist vision of moving from margin to center, I do think even as that phrase is circulating, there is a kind of serious, reflection, if not interrogation, on what that would mean. It's kind of a master's tools question, right? Like, in shuffling about, right, and sort of moving around between margin and center, we also need to interrogate the use value of the marginal position at all, right? And or do we need a whole new spatial metaphor? This brings me to Hortense Spillers and the interstice, right? And like, how can we imagine a kind of flexible weave of spatial positionalities that is necessarily sort of at least constantly critiquing structures of power, But from a fiction writer standpoint, I mean, Cheryl, to further clarify what I was saying, first of all, yeah, the known world is a really interesting example, right?
I'm sorry.
No, go for it. What were you saying?
Historically, only a certain group has been allowed to occupy the center, right? And we assume that the margins are somehow inferior to the center. So I guess that's what my friend's husband meant.
So Cheryl, we're going to ask you to come, ironically, to come back on video since you're in and out anyway. We would just love to see your beautiful face. And then when we catch you, we can catch you.
Sorry, in the margins.
I'm not sure if you heard me, Cheryl, but if you would come back on video, we can see you at least.
I'm really sorry about this.
It's all good. We just want to be able to catch what you say. It's like, dripping, like, oh.
Take what you can get. This is excellent.
But we don't, Crescent, we don't have to stay on this question. I just was interested in it in terms of fiction.
Yeah. Well, can we talk, since you're talking about sort of the differences in writing and how, like, Mecca, you framing yourself as a fiction writer, and Cheryl, very obviously as a poet. Can you talk about some writing practices? I'm sure in interviews you all are asked about sort of writing practices that work for you. I'm actually interested in writing practices that don't that have not or do not work for you, or have not sort of worked for you, if you wouldn't mind to sort of share about praxis and process.
Well, that was a good question. What does not work for you? And I'll tell you what does not work for me. Writing every day at a certain time for a certain amount of time.
Yay, I'm happy to hear you say that.
That has never worked for me. But
I love the emotion we're getting.
I know.
You know, that's how I feel when I think about that
I
practice.
want the stuff to be published. So when I have, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I'm talking anyway. When I have a publication goal, I feel I can more easily engage in the process of writing. But I don't just do it to do it. That's a lie. I keep a journal, and I've kept one since 1976. I always have a journal, but that's not writing I ever want to publish, you know. So that's basically the most defined practice. I mean, the most defined practice that works for me when I have that goal of publication.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that might sound egotistical, but it's the truth.
And Mecca.
100%. Yeah. And if it's egotistical, it's my truth as well. Preston, I feel like it seemed like you were vibing on that answer too.
Indeed.
Yeah, that whole, and I tried it. I think, you know, when you're starting out, right, you try, you know, you hear the wisdom of writers you admire, and many of writers that I admire, yeah, that practice works for them. I get up at 4 a.m. every day, and before I have my coffee, you know, I sit down and I tried, and, you know, I feel like I might have gotten a good 20, 25 pages that way, but that's just not how it works for me either.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Cheryl, the way you described, I think is very similar to my practice. I don't think we've ever actually talked about daily writing practices, so it's interesting to hear yours. But yeah, I think mine is similar. I keep a journal also. And I do try to write something every day. I try to journal every day. It's on my daily to-do list, you know. Whether I get to it every day is another thing. But it's always like, you know, it's part of my, you know, sort of general routine. It's an aspirational part of my daily routine, right, is writing. But that's separate from whatever deadline I have. Like you, Cheryl, I absolutely am deadline driven, for better and for worse. You know, it's sometimes overwhelming when you have a lot of deadlines and suddenly you're like, wow, I really, you know, feel that
I know.
that drive, right? You're like, okay, it's nice when you have one deadline and you can use that to kind of motivate you. When you have several, it can be an inundation. But I think that too.
But that's a practice though, you know, having to satisfy those multiple deadlines, you know, that's.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I'm happy to have that name actually as a practice, as a way of orienting oneself toward one's writing, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so to that question, I wanted to ask about being a writer. You both have sort of self-identified as writers, and thinking about your sort of daily practices. Like, how much does being a writer, identifying as a writer, sort of affect your lens, your sort of daily living, the way you see the world?
You better go for that, Mecca.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question as well. Partly because my impulse is to say it's the other way around, right? That like the way I see the world is what makes me a writer. You know, I think I have always been, I mean, not to like, whatever, it sounds very, you know, sort of romantic or what have you, but I do think I've always been interested in kind of observing the world from a distance. My earliest journals are from when I was 6. And when I look back at those journals, I was always like, this person said this interesting thing and their voice was strange. And what does that mean? You know what I'm saying? And also the kind of self-reflection that I think often goes into, journaling and, any kind of memoir as well, sort of being curious about the self and being curious about the world. And part of that for me comes from feeling like an outsider in multiple ways and feeling different in multiple ways. Certainly, Cheryl, you mentioned like the body, and this is something I think that both of us have in common in our writing, right? Sort of constantly thinking through what it means to encounter one's body as different, either because of the shape and space and size and textures of the body, or the desires of the body, right? When you encounter yourself as different within communities that are already understood as different, to me at least, that has led to the desire to kind of write it down, to figure it out,
Yeah. Well, that was put beautifully. No, it was. I guess I see that process as between identity I don't see it as not that I'm saying you do, one preceding the other or one more facilitative or dominant than the other. Sometimes I listen to myself talk and then I'm saying, no, would you shut up?
You sound.
No, that's not what we want.
So I see it more as a reciprocalness, if there's such a word.
Yes. I mean, so earlier, Mecca, you described your sort of writing as an attempt to understand and be understood. And I think, so both of those things seem to be operating within what inspires the writing. But I'm interested in like, why, like, who are you writing to, right? What is the sort of, what compels you to write the thing down? You sort of suggested, Mecca, at least, that like, sort of trying to figure things out, but like, what compels the writing? So I understand like what inspires it, but when you actually put it down, what compels you to keep doing that over and over and over again?
I think for me, it's audience. It's knowing that there are people out there who want it. And also being, in concert with other writers who are in the same community, who kind of set a bar for one's writing.
So a sense of that the audience needs. You say the audience that wants it, and when you say the sort of it, what is the it? The kind of that the audience.
The subject matter of one's writing. Like, okay, I know that there are lesbians out there who are just dying for my poetry. Not dying, but who want it.
Yeah.
As opposed to how others might make us think that there's nobody out there who wants it, that you don't have an audience, which is a similar kind of trick that was played on Black people, even though we have Black people have a literary history. Black people in this country, in the United States, have a literary history that's older than most white people's literary history in this country. I think we were made to think nobody wants your writing. Nobody's interested in some poor Black man in a Chicago ghetto, or some poor Black woman in a That's why I think audience.
I wonder if she's
Okay.
Out there that wants lesbian writing or queer writing.
yeah.
Goodness knows that. But we've learned there are many people. So that's they people who want the subject matter of one's writing.
Mhm.
It's not the writing itself.
Mm.
No.
Mm-hmm. Mecca, is that similar for you? Like that the audience compels?
Yeah, it's both. And I appreciate the way you phrased that, Cheryl, that the audience, just sort of knowing that the audience is there and that they want it, and perhaps even that they need it.
They do need it.
They need it, right? And that for me is really helpful to think about, because I need it too. So I feel there's a sense of kind of community in writing, even though, depending on what you're writing, right? As a fiction writer, I imagine as a poet, there are moments that are, and as a scholar, right? There are moments that are extremely solitary. And yet when you connect with the part of you that needs to write it and the part of you that needs to have read it, right? And realize, okay, there are communities of people who share that need, then suddenly I think it creates a sense of meaning. And there is that's part of the kind of the push to the page. Certainly I think there's something sustaining about that, but thinking about contributing to the body of work that has sustained you is so gratifying, right? And really sort of pushes you forward. And then, it's this really kind of amazing intergenerational, transhistoric gathering, right, of voices, for me, Black, queer, and feminist voices that, again, the idea of being part of that and contributing to that for some young reader, it's romantic, but it's also just like incredibly beautiful. And that is a huge part of what kind of gets me through, especially when there's a challenging writing, project that I have on my plate.
Yeah, right. No. The idea of making a contribution is important too. Yes, that's what I wanted to do when I published my dissertation. I wanted to contribute to that body of Black literary knowledge. And making that contribution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you did. I have it right here.
Go on.
Oh.
Yeah, I like that book.
I like it too.
Yeah, so speaking of contributions, both of you have recently sort of contributed to this book, Mouths of Rain, an anthology of Black lesbian thought. And I wanted to sort of ask you all to sort of frame your contributions to this book. Cheryl, you wrote the foreword as well. And just in terms of how you came to be a part of this, I think a document or something that speaks to the history that you're talking about, that it has been historically, there have been audiences that want it and need it, and people who have been producing it, right? So I think this is a really good example of just what you're talking about. So if you all could talk about sort of how you came to contribute and what it sort of means to you to be a part of it.
I speak. And she was doing, do you know her? She was doing her dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
And Beverly Guy Sheftel. Can y'all hear me? Beverly Guy Sheftel.
We heard that part.
Yeah.
Beverly Guy Sheftel seduced her into editing this anthology. And she asked me what I thought, should she do it? And of course I said no, because she was working on her dissertation. Well, it's a good thing she didn't pay me any attention, but she went on and did it. She did that. She finished her dissertation and she got a job at UConn. That's where she's going to be in the fall. So, well, that's my little sideline. That's my little side story on that book. But I was happy to write the foreword, which she asked me to do. And I have a poem in it too, though it wouldn't have been the poem I would have chosen to go in it. She's the editor, you know what I mean? And I think it's a very good book. The pieces are well chosen.
What poem would you have chosen, Cheryl?
I would have chosen probably a later poem, like something more current. Because that's from 1986. And I hope she doesn't hear me. I frankly think it needs to be in the context it's in that book, Living as a Lesbian, because that's a book of, like a lot of sexual poetry. And I think out there by itself, anyway, that's my feeling about it. I would have chosen something more current. But
and what would you say about your current work that you think would be better sort of suited? I'm not sure if you heard me or didn't hear me or are pausing. Oh, shoot.
Oh. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if I think my later work is better. Some of it is. But it deals with a different subject matter, and I try to integrate the sexuality in two poems as what in poem, sexual poem, like I have this poem called History, and this current.
No.
It's about sexual history, personal sexual history. So I guess I do that kind of thing. I mean, I do more of an integrative thing now and work that is sparer.
Thanks. Yeah, and then Mecca, can you talk about how you came to contribute?
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, so I got an email asking me to contribute, an email from Brianna Jones, the fantastic editor of the anthology we're talking about, which is Mouths of Rain. Check it out, everybody. I think it's the second half of the title is an anthology of Black thought, right? Yeah. Yes. And so, as Cheryl was saying, it was framed as a kind of companion piece to Words of Fire, the iconic, foundational anthology that is multi-genre and kind of, again, multi-generational. And so this this anthology does similar work. So yeah, I mean, as soon as I got the email, I was like, yes, yes, and yes, I am in 100%. And I'm gonna, you know, shout it out every chance I get. It's actually also right here. You know, it stays on my little Zoom perch situation because it's just such a phenomenal accomplishment. And as you said, Crescent, one of those texts that is wanted and needed, you know,
Yeah.
by those of us who know we need it and by those who don't know that they need it. And so I think that that's, you know, as soon as I learned about the project, I was definitely down. I'm trying to remember whether, I think Brianna asked specifically for Wolfpack, which is the short story.
Right.
And so, you know, and that's a story about the New Jersey Four, which is a group of 4 of 7 Black lesbian friends who were charged and convicted of attempted murder and felony gang assault of a man who assaulted them and threatened to rape them in the West Village in the early 2000s. And so it sort of is thinking about their case, you know, both the assault itself and some of the court proceedings following, you know, their arrest. And I think that, you know, it was an important story to kind of bring back into the conversation. It just so happened to have come out last year at a moment where there's a lot of conversation about, you know, sort of criminal justice, about the carceral system. And it, to my mind at least, a really sort of stunning lack of conversation about the place of Black women in those discussions. And so, you know, it was meaningful to me to be able to kind of talk about that story and to talk about their case in the context of these conversations we're having right now. So I was grateful for that. But it's just a phenomenal anthology. And Cheryl, it's so interesting to hear you say, you had mentioned before that you would have chosen a different story. We did a reading together with Beverly Guy Sheftall and Brianna for Kara's books at the launch of the anthology. And Cheryl, you said something similar there. But I have to say, and I, you know, selfishly, perhaps, as a writer, as a reader, and as a teacher, I'm glad that she pulled that poem, because I do think for the archive, you know, that poem really brings the rawness, the bodiness, Crescent, that you mentioned, right? There's the rawness of the erotic that I think is important to capture, and especially in an anthology like this that really is doing so much important work, you know, again, across several decades, several generations, and several genres. You know, my 2 cents. I'm glad it worked out the way it did.
She did a very good job on it. I think she must be kind of brilliant.
I think probably that seems to be the case.
Kind of brilliant.
Kind of brilliant, that one. Yeah.
But I want to say something, Mecca.
Yes.
I told her she better put you in it.
Oh, is that right? Okay, well, that's how that went.
She asked me, are there people in the audience?
Yes.
I hope I didn't curse too much. But I said, do you know Mecca? She said, yes, I do know her. I said, she has short fiction. You should include her. I said, do you like her writing? She said, yes, I like it very much. And she is good.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. So that's the hidden backstory behind the anthology that I didn't.
Yeah, when it just goes to show, you know, how important it is to, like you were talking about, sort of writing for an audience, but also a dimension of writing that both of you mentioned was being in community, sort of how you sort of write as an individual person, but that being in community as a writer is really, really important. So I wanted to know, and there's a question from the audience about both of your roles in stewarding community over time, and sort of what has that done for your creative work?
Oh, goodness. I like those glasses, Crescent. Where did you get them?
Thank you so much. They're from Tardy. It's a company in France.
Okay, oh la la.
Oh, yes. I just got some frames from France. They're very...
See, I'm just trying to be like you.
Basically. I love it. And now we get a close up with Cheryl's glasses too.
I know.
Do you want to answer that question? I mean, do you want to go for it, Mecca?
Sure. I mean, I'm curious to your answer, especially because, you know, when Chris was reading the bios, it stood out to me, that line of Cheryl Clarke as a facilitator, right, of all things Black and queer and feminist. And I'm like, well, I like that. And I'm eager to hear your answer. I guess quickly, I'll just say, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, everything I think that one would expect. I enjoy bringing communities together. You know, in my academic work, I think a lot about multiplicities of voice and collectivities and sort of and even hybridity, like we were talking about with the My Life documentary, what can happen when you bring several disparate voices or perspectives together in one space, whether that's a textual space or a physical space. And so, you know, as a curator of things, as a person who likes to put together events, as a person who likes to, you know, make introductions and kind of connect people, I do think there's something really creative and, you know, sort of politically necessary about those kinds of you know, projects for me as well.
But what about what they've done for your work? Like, what does being in community sort of do, like, for your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, y'all saw it here. Apparently, it helps me get into groundbreaking anthologies. So, you know, there's that. But I think in terms of putting together those kinds of communities, you know, it helps. This might sound a little bit redundant, but it does help me to remember why I'm drawn toward multiplicity. I tend to write in multiple points of view. I tend to think about, again, multiple centers in my work. And that's because I think that way in life as well. And I think for me, at least, it's necessary, you know? So it sort of keeps me alive and awake to multiplicity in my own writing as well. In addition to, you know, leading to collectives. I participate, I'm in and out of several kind of writing groups and groups of writers who help sort of either help one another create and workshop work, or sort of help each other get work out into the world. And that is generated from that standpoint as well. But there's something I think deeply aesthetic for me about just thinking about multiplicity and collectivity. That's part of my work as a creative writer as well. Mm-hmm. Cheryl, what about you?
Well, I spent 9 years editing a journal, Conditions, from 81 to 90. And so in that way, I got to see a lot of writing and to move a lot of writing by lesbians. Well, not only lesbians, you know, it wasn't, Conditions was open to all women for whom women are an integral part of their lives. So I got to see a lot of people's writing, and I got to know a lot of writers, which was another way I knew that there was an audience out there, you know, that there were people out there who wanted the writing and needed it. You know, when you think of sometimes the isolation that lesbian identity or LGBT identity used to impose on people. So sometimes I don't want to make it worse than it is. But sometimes, you know, something like a lesbian journal is a person's main connection to that identity, or main connection to the community they can only connect with through the writing of multiple people, as in a journal. So
yeah, so I this feels like, I guess, a sort of obvious question, which is why I guess I didn't pose it earlier, but it has seemed to come back to thinking about your identities as Black lesbians specifically. And you mentioned when you are both talking about the audiences that needs it, and I'm gathering that it needs is a sort of representation of this specific identity. And I guess I just wanted to know sort of what is the meaning of that to you? And so when you frame yourself as a Black lesbian writer, what is the meaning of that to you?
Well, it's a naming, and it's a way to reach out and make contact with other Black lesbian feminists or other Black lesbian writers. So it's another way to create community, I suppose.
So the naming is important insofar as it identifies a community, both for yourself and for other people, for the audience to whom you're writing or for whom you're writing.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And that's something that Black consciousness taught all of us. You know.
And Mecca, did you want to weigh in on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really kind of sipping on that last gem that Cheryl brought us about sort of how Black consciousness, Black thought really informs how we understand lesbianness. I'm thinking about queerness, right? Because, you know, if someone was to ask me, you know, sort of who I am as a writer, I think I would probably say I'm a Black queer feminist writer. It doesn't mean that I'm not a Black lesbian, but I go to queer because of historic, at least, investment in naming difference in kind of complex, nuanced ways. And of course, my vision of queer comes right from Black feminism, right? And I think about Kathy Cohen, and I think of people who think about queerness as, you know, sort of anti-normative, anti-oppressive, right? Anti-hegemonic in multiple ways.
Right.
You know? And so for me, that is absolutely central to who I am and why I write. And yeah, Cheryl, you kind of just brought us all the way back to like, we don't get to queer in that vision without going through Black, right? Like queerness, that kind of anti-normative, anti-oppressive vision of queerness doesn't happen without a Black political thought. And that in some ways, that's kind of why I tend to go to queer rather than to lesbian, although I think that you're pointing out that that's true of lesbian as well. So I don't even know if that answers the question at all, but that's what I was thinking in that moment.
Oh,
yeah.
I can't tell if Cheryl's freezing or has a thought.
I know, but I love it either way.
It was. I mean, I like queer. I like it for its irony.
Yeah.
But at this point, I am not going to call myself queer because I've called myself a lesbian for so long. You know what I mean?
No, we don't necessarily know what you mean.
Because you've called yourself queer in the past as well, right? So I'm so curious. Oh, that was a fake out.
I mean, I think this question is so interesting. Okay. Especially when I'm thinking about Mouths of Rain, even how it describes itself, right? As both a lesbian, a compendium of lesbian writing, but then also sort of lesbian and other identifying, and then also in terms of Blackness, sort of like African American and also Afro diasporic kind of. So these kind of framings are very interesting and very important, actually, how people are positioned differently within.
Absolutely. And I do think it's about, I mean, I love, Crescent, what your bio says about self-translation, right? I mean, I think part of the efforts that we're making in thinking about how to navigate these languages is how do we talk about ourselves in a kind of a language that is, if not consistent, at least translatable, right? So then lesbian doesn't mean exactly what it may have meant to, you know, a given writer 30 years ago. Maybe lesbian is as capacious. And I think this is the vision of lesbian that Brianna is going for, right, in that anthology, that lesbian becomes as capacious as queer. Queer becomes as capacious as Black. Black becomes as capacious as queer and informs queer and lesbian. And yet I think we're also all really working hard, well, many of us are working hard to make sure that these words retain a kind of, I don't want to say integrity, but retain their wholeness, right? And retain, you know, their specificity. Which is hard, but luckily this is what we do. We're writers, right? So we work with language in these ways. Cheryl, are you back with us? Because I feel like I really want to hear how where you are now in terms of queer versus lesbian in your descriptions of yourself.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see it as queer versus or lesbian versus queer. I just see it as, you know, lesbian and then colon.
Yeah.
African American queer. Queer.
I like it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. You know, it makes me think of Audre Lorde and how she's always invoking her identity in several complex ways. And, you know, very rarely does she repeat a particular sort of of herself, right? She's a Black lesbian feminist poet, cancer survivor, you know, mother, member of an interracial couple.
Yes, right.
Ambidextrous, right? And there's an aesthetic praxis to how she self-translates that I think we can learn a lot. Certainly I try to learn a lot from the way she explains herself.
Yeah.
Was she ambidextrous?
Well, yes, in Zami, she refers to herself as half fat, Black, half blind, and ambidextrous.
Oh goodness, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Well, I know she had very poor eyesight. However, you know that poem she writes to contact lenses in Black Unicorn?
You see?
For real?
On that one.
Extremely thick lenses all the time. She just needed reading glasses.
Okay.
But yes, you know, could not ambidextrous.
So we wanted to, I think we're sort of time is coming to a close. So I guess I wanted to end sort of by asking if there's anything that you all wanted to, projects that you have that are coming up that you wanted to talk about or looking forward to. And if there are any last words that you have in reflection about each other. There's a question from the chat still about this question about the margin to center. I don't know if that wants to be brought up again sort of in the end, but I think that one thing that you all have been pointing towards is that the specificity of Mecca, the characters that you write, Cheryl, the poems, the sort of presentation of the poems that you write, that this is sort of important work in terms of however we're deciding that we are about the center and the margin, but that there is something about representing the margin that's really, really important. So I guess if there were any kind of closing words or anything that you all wanted to share before we close this out for today.
I mean, I would just say thank you. Thank you, Paul Robeson House. Thank you, Crescent. Thank you, Cheryl. It's always a delight to be in conversation with you. And, you know, I'm excited for your forthcoming projects. I feel like I've gotten an inside track on hearing what Cheryl Clarke is up to, and I can't wait for those to be out in the world. So yeah, gratitude. That's my parting note.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I also thank Christopher and the Paul Robeson House from the margins. And I thank you, Crescent, for your wonderful, I love the way you spell your first name. Nobody nobody has a name. Oh, that's not true. My little nephew's name is Quentin.
Okay, all right.
You, but I like the way you spell your name, and this was a good discussion, and I wish there were not so many technical difficulties, and I'm sorry. I think that I caused them because I'm in this hotel.
No worries, no worries. Oh, we are just happy to be able to hear you, and we could hear you. And I think this has made everyone thirsty for more of that work. That when you talk about people dying for your work, you've made to be dying for your work. So thank you, and thank you also, Mecca. It's always lovely to hear you pontificate and to hear you sort of talk and be brilliant. Oh, and I was going to ask you, Cheryl, if you would let us see you before we close out. So
okay, there I am.
It's lovely. So back to you, Chris. Thank you so much for having us. And if you have any closing words.
I just want to, thank you all really. And I think, in the first 10 minutes, I'm like, technical difficulties, what's happening? But then as I'm starting to sit in and listen to the stories, and it became almost like a moment where it would cut off, and I'm like, just imagining the possibilities of what could be said in that moment. And it becomes more of like the multiplicity of readings, right? That Mecca talked about, of like, this could go this way, this could go that way. I do not know. I have to wait till Cheryl comes back and tell us where we landed.
Terrible. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No, it was beautiful. And I think it was also the universe saying that we need to definitely, still come together in person as well. And now that we have the Robeson House available, anytime you are in the Philadelphia area, we are here to kind of, be that space and kind of keep these conversations and these gatherings going.
Yeah. We should do it. We should do it in person, Christopher.
For sure. And we definitely want to keep the thread going so that we get to that point. I know the festival is coming up again this year, right? And that's right, Cheryl? When's the festival?
It will be, we're having virtual workshops. We're having 6 of them. We're not bringing people together. I mean, we're not having in-person this year because people are still really tentative about the COVID stuff, which I don't blame them. So we're gonna aim for an in-person festival in 22, the fall of 2022.
Yes. So we'll definitely be on the lookout for that. And I know the book is coming out really, really soon, right, Mecca? The Forms of Difference book?
Yes, September. The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora comes out in September. So.
Yes.
Great.
So that could also be a opportunity. And I should probably say, before we close, that AWP is going to be in Philadelphia next year. The huge sort of gathering of writers, and so the Robeson House definitely wants to be a part and continuing to build community. So we should probably talk about that too.
Yeah, right.
And Crescent, thank you so much for being an amazing moderator and bringing your brilliance, your great questions to the conversation. And we look forward to being part of your project too. It's coming up this fall.
Yes.
So this is really exciting. Thank you all for being part of the Robeson House and Museum event. This conversation will be recorded on YouTube and available. We had many people watching online and being part of the conversation. So really excited for this. Until another edition of We Are Each Other's Harvest, I want to say thank you. And then we could talk afterwards about who should be next in this series. So you could put those in the comments in the chats as well. So thank you all again for spending a part of your Saturday afternoon with us. And yeah, find us more, paulrobesonhouse.org, Robeson House PHL on Twitter. And we're also on Instagram now, Robeson House PHL. And I don't know if anyone else want to give out their social media, or we'll just sort of close it there.
Thank you again, Christopher.
Thank you. Yeah, everyone.
Thank you all. All right, I'm stop the recording.